Hi friends, welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. And the project is to work through the whole Bible together, verse by verse, in depth, over however long that takes. You're very welcome whether you're here for the very first time or you've been here from the very beginning. We're more than halfway through our season in the book of Leviticus, and I'll be asking the question today is why is this thing called Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, why is it still important for us as Christian believers? Can I suggest that if you are here for the first time and you're finding this teaching valuable, then why not click on the subscribe button wherever it is you get your podcast from, and that way you need never miss another single episode. And can I remind you just also to hang around at the end, and I'll tell you lots of ways you can connect with this ministry and receive episode notes page, transcripts of each episode, stuff like that. Things that I hope will really be helpful for you in your walk in studying and working together through the Bible. So with that said, I'll say bye-bye for now, and I'll see you at the end of today's study. Yom Kippur, often referred to as the Day of Atonement, was a significant and holy and solemn day, and that day is outlined for us in the Old Testament, specifically here in Leviticus chapter 16. So what exactly is it all about? And what does, if anything, does it still have to do with us today as Christian believers? That's what I want to look at today. So let me turn to the passage where Moses tells the people and talks about this day. Today, by modern Jewish people, it's referred to as Yom Kippur. But in our English language versions of the Old Testament, it's usually straightforwardly called the Day of Atonement, and it's described for us here in some detail in chapter 16. As is our pattern, I shall be working through the entire chapter, verse by verse pretty much, but to save time in these long Levitical chapters, I won't be reading it. There'll be a link in the episode notes to where you can connect to the chapter on Bible Gateway, and if not, might be helpful just to have Leviticus chapter 16 either open in the Bible or on your phone or at whatever place you're listening to this. Okay, off we go. Well, the first thing I want to say about the Day of Atonement is the fact that it takes place 6 months after Passover. There are two great feasts in the Jewish calendar, and they're 6 months apart. Passover is a day of great rejoicing, celebrating the deliverance from slavery of the Israelite people held captive in Egypt. But here, on this other day, the Day of Atonement, that is a day of great solemnity in Israel. So in a sense, in terms of their tone, they're almost exactly polar opposites. Now, the opening verses will introduce us to what is called the preparation phase, but it begins, first of all, by Moses issuing a precaution. In the light of the reminder given in the opening verses, where Aaron and his sons are warned at what happened to the other brothers, remember the ones who died, who approached the tabernacle and these ordinances in a rather flippant, some would say blasphemous way, it then gives more details about what they're to do in preparation of this important event. Verse 3 states, Aaron shall come into the holy place with the blood of a young bull as a sin offering and a ram as a burnt offering. So in the light of these preceding verses, when Aaron comes in, he's bringing these offerings in, and these offerings have taken place outside in the courtyard, remember. The burnt offering was now going to be part of a ritual that was going to take place within the Holy of Holies. Verse 4 continues, He shall put on the holy linen tunic and the linen trousers on his body, and he shall be girded with a linen sash and a linen turban, and he shall be attired in these holy garments. Therefore he shall wash his body in water and then put them on. So at this stage, before going in, he has to wash his whole body in water. And remember, this basin is outside the tabernacle structure proper. That's where the ceremonial washing of the body will take place. And then he has to change into these clothes. Now, you may have noticed that this is a very different, distinctive type of outfit. He's going to put on the clothes, the official clothes of the high priest. And he puts those on always before entering the Holy of Holies. And what you may have noticed is they're all just described as linen. So he's got to remove these clothes and put on what are effectively very simple linen clothing, comprising of a shirt, a long shirt, shorts, a sash, and a turban. These garments are much plainer than those worn by him in his everyday officiating as an ordinary priest. His priestly garments were quite ornate, the ones that he wore while performing regular duties. But this uniform, if you like, he changes into is much simpler. It consists of plain white garments, the idea being here that he is meant to appear before God, before the Lord himself, as a servant, not in any way as a sort of high priest or king. In fact, these clothes that he's changing into are even simpler than the ordinary lower rank priests who are serving outside and around the tabernacle area. The whole idea is that he is the one who's going into the presence of God, and he must be stripped of anything that would suggest honor, authority, or position, and he must become a humble servant before he enters into the presence of the King of Kings. And this humble status is symbolized by him changing into this simple attire. Now, all this is about the preparation of not describing what's going to happen yet. The details continue in verses 5 to 7, when it says, "And he shall take from the congregation of the children of Israel 2 kids of goat as a sin offering and 1 ram as a burnt offering. Aaron shall offer the bull," that was mentioned in the earlier verses, "as a sin offering for himself, making atonement for himself and his house. He shall then take the 2 goats and present them before the Lord at the door of the tabernacle, the first compartment of the tent." I'll just continue. Verse 8 reveals the next step. "Then Aaron shall cast lots for the 2 goats, one for the Lord and the other for it to be a scapegoat." Now, that's a familiar term in English. Experts say that it is actually taken from this ancient text. Now, in the modern sense of the word, what we have in a scapegoat is one who gets the blame for something he didn't do, or someone that maybe who's willing to take the blame in order to spare someone else. And that's, of course, what's going on here. It's where we get that term. So we see here there are going to be 2 goats, and 1 goat is going to be sacrificed, and the other is going to be sent out into the wilderness. It's going to just depart. The symbolism here is meant to be very clear and obvious. The scapegoat symbolizes the removal of the sins of the Israelites, and the other goat symbolizes the fact that the sin itself is departed, it's sent away. Verse 9 continues, "And Aaron shall bring the goat on which the Lord's lot fell, and offer it as a sin offering. But the goat on which the lot fell to be the scapegoat shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement upon it, and it will be let go as the scapegoat let free into the wilderness." All of this stuff going on, remember, is preparation for a procedure, something that we're going to get into in a minute. But that's the general outline of what's going on. But what about the procedure itself? What's going to happen? Well, that starts in chapter 16, verse 11, and it says, "And Aaron will bring the bull of the sin offering, which is for himself, and make atonement for himself and his house, and he shall kill the bull as a sin offering, which is for himself." So this verse, it's a repetition, but it's there to say very clearly that the sprinkling of the blood and the sacrifice of the bull is for Aaron and his household. And that is described in the verses that follow through to verse 14. The rest of the procedure is going to be that he's going to do the same thing for the people in verse 15, then for the tabernacle building itself in verses 16 and 17, and for the altar even in verses 18 and 19. So this procedure amounts to the sprinkling of sacrificial blood for the cleansing of all these various levels of entities, not just Aaron and his household himself, but also the people and the tabernacle building and even the altar within it. Now, normally, so far in Leviticus, we've thought of blood offerings as simply covering people and their sins. And of course, it does, and that's the main thing. But in this case, on this single day, this annual Day of Atonement, it's going to be for Aaron, the high priest, and his family and his household, and for all the people, but also for the tabernacle itself and even the altar within it. So the Day of Atonement, the procedure that is gone through is first the high priest cleanses himself, then he goes through a ritual to cover the sins of his household and his family, and then one to cover the sins of the people. So far, so good. We've seen that sort of thing before, haven't we? We might expect that. We might expect, of course, that anyone in a priestly ministry should cleanse themselves before ministering to others. Even that principle applies in the New Testament today. It's obvious that the ones who sin, anyone who sins, in fact, needs to be cleansed before coming into the presence of the Lord. But what's interesting here is what happens in this verse 16, where it says that he shall make atonement for the holy place because of the uncleanliness of the children of Israel and because of transgression for all their sins. And the procedure then says he has to go into the tabernacle of meeting, which stood amongst them in the midst of their uncleanliness. So that's quite striking in it, is it? The actual tabernacle structure itself, the whole holy place, needs to have an atonement offering. I find that quite striking, really. It itself, the building and the stuff within it, according to verse 16 and beyond, because it and has been in the presence and has had sinful human beings around it and going in of itself, it in itself, in a way, has been made ceremonially unclean. The people, who after all are fallen human beings, sinful human beings, they've been into the holy place. Now, they may have been just priests and even the high priests in the Holy of Holies, but the very presence of humanity has contaminated that place, and the whole place is seen to need cleansing here. So what do the people do on this Day of Atonement? Well, on that day, that one day a year, a priest makes an atonement, and he does that by fasting. Now, fasting was an indication that that person, even the high priest, recognized the need to set aside time to seek God, and that was more important than anything in his life, and should be more important in the sense that he shouldn't even take time to eat. So he's not going to eat, and the idea is the person is going to seek the Lord, and doing that and being right with God is more important even than eating. In verse 30 then, it tells us, on that date, the priest will make atonement for you, that is the people, to cleanse you that you may be clean. So the promise is that what is going on here is going to cleanse not only the high priest, but all the people, all of the children of the nation of Israel. But he has to fast. He has to say that is his priority, holy on that day. Then verse 31, it is a Sabbath, a solemn rest for you, and you shall afflict your souls, and it is a statute. In other words, he's saying that you've got to do this, and you've got to do this not just once on that day, you're going to have to do it again and again and mark out that special day for, well, this Day of Atonement, once a year forever, once a year from that day forward. In other words, it's not going to work if you just do this the once. You're going to have to repeat this every year. And then the text concluding, getting to the conclusion, beginning in verse 30, says, and the priest, so this is how he is to do it, who is anointed and consecrated to minister as a priest in his holy garments, will make atonement and put on the linen and the holy garments, and then he shall make atonement in the holy sanctuary for the tabernacle of meeting and the altar, and he shall make atonement for not just the priest, but all the people of the sanctuary. And then it concludes this chapter, verse 34, by saying, and this will be an everlasting statute for you to make atonement for the children of Israel for all their sins once a year, as he did, as the Lord commanded Moses. Okay, that's the preparation, and that's the procedure for this thing called Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Okay, I want to make a couple of observations here. There are certain things that repeat in this chapter, and one of them that repeats, which you can't help but notice, is it's actually said 3 times, including this final paragraph. It states that this is to be an everlasting covenant, what is called a statute. And the other observation we need to know that this was a full and complete atonement for all the people, the priesthoods, everything to do with Israel and the nation for their sins. And the third observation is, yes, it needs to be repeated, and it needs to be done once a year, every year, and it takes place 6 months after Passover. So the Israelites repeated this year after year, year after year. We see it again many times in the Old Testament stories. Okay, so that's what's happening. Well, let me make a few observations from a New Covenant, New Testament perspective. Tradition says that on the Day of Atonement in Jesus' time, no less than 500 priests were involved in this special service. So this was a big deal in Israel's annual calendar. But we have to point out that all of this is going on around, first of all, the tabernacle and then the temple in Jesus' day. But we also know that in AD 78, the Romans came in and destroyed that temple, and from that day to this, there not has been an ability to observe the Day of Atonement in the way as described here, because they don't have a tabernacle or a temple. Now, the rabbis of the New Testament times and beyond wanted to preserve the rituals of the Day of Atonement for future generations, hold on to its meaning, but of course they couldn't continue the practice because it was all specified to do with the temple. Even the cleansing of that temple is part of it. So get this, what did they do? Well, they substituted and switched some things. They substituted the things that are going on and described here. They substituted them for a day of prayer and repentance and giving to charity. So in other words, they made that the sacrifice and used these sacrifices as replacement for the rituals that they could no longer practice as described here. And they also preserved the practice, the new type of practice, by giving it a description of its own and a ritual and creating a special scroll, a special prayer book that has been used ever since on Yom Kippur. So even today, Jews celebrate this, but they have substituted animal sacrifice for a day of prayer, repentance, and giving to charity. And they do all that, and they have to do all that and reconstitute it in that way because they don't have a tabernacle or a temple anymore. Okay, so what can we learn from all this? Well, I suppose the big thing here, the thing that we must first of all take is, see the wood before we look at the trees, is to suggest the number one thing is that this illustrates the comprehensive nature of sin. As I pointed out as we went through the passage, sin here is seen to contaminate everything, even the holy place itself, the structures and the place of meeting God itself. And that occurs because of the ubiquity of sin, because it sits in the midst of a sinful people. The sacrifice and the offerings described in the law that went on day by day were not seen as sufficient to cleanse all the defilement of the people. This much sin, this much uncleanliness still needed to be dealt with and removed. Therefore, God appointed this special yearly ultra-sacrifice, if you like, that cleansed all the sins and all the impurities, not covered for or atoned for by means of that which the Israelites committed to do daily. The sacrifice, or the Day of Atonement, is the most comprehensive and far-reaching of all the sacrifices in the calendar of the nation of Israel. And as you go through the passage, it talks about the fact that this is to cover all the sins of the people. It says that in verse 20 and verse 30. So all these sins are seen to be affecting everything. Now today, in our day, we may talk about that in terms of things like the doctrine of total depravity, which basically means that every part of the human condition is affected by sin. Our minds, our emotions, even our bodies, our conscience and our senses. Romans chapter 8 sums this up powerfully and poetically when it says the whole creation groans for the Redeemer to come back and redeem it. We've polluted ourselves and we've polluted this planet. And ain't that the truth when we look around us today? We've polluted this whole place. I think there's an essence here, as we see in the Bible, it talks about in Revelation, about God needing to, in fact, create a new heaven and a new earth. And maybe it could be because of the fact that we have so polluted this place. But we're not only polluted this planet, we're also not satisfied with this. Just this week, we've had in the news here in the UK, and I'm sure in America, the fact that a huge fine has been handed out to a satellite company who have been literally throwing junk into space. So we're doing that as well now. And it is for this reason, I think the Bible points out the fact that God needs to start over with a new heaven and a new earth. And I think that's because the sin and the effects of our sin have contaminated the whole thing. So I think the big picture here we shouldn't miss is this passage illustrates the nature and the ubiquity of sin. Even the holy place, sin has contaminated the very holy of holies. The altar itself needs to be cleansed. Wow. But let me make a second suggestion as to what's going on here. Something that we can also need and should learn from this Day of Atonement. And the second thing goes hand in hand with the first. Because sin is persuasive, atonement needs to be comprehensive as well. You see, normally you would have expected, well, they'd set up all these rules and regulations and rituals. Surely that would be enough to have covered everything off. Surely every individual sin would have been atoned for by the religious and sacrificial spiritual life of these people in Moses' day. But I think what this passage puts the finger on from our point of view is the need for there to be enormous once and for all atonement because of the pervasiveness of sin everywhere in the human condition. So what they do day by day, week by week, even in and of itself in this Day of Atonement every year, it tells you that it doesn't actually work beyond that year. They did it last year and they have to do it again this year. So they've got to do these things again and again and again. Now, what I'm going to do to close off today is we're going to turn again to the book of Hebrews for a few minutes because I want us to look quickly through chapters 9 to 11. Hebrews is the amazing book that interprets the book of Leviticus and the whole Levitical laws for us. Listen to this. It's going to explain what this all means for us today. Hebrews chapter 9, beginning verse 11, tells us this. This is how it works out for us today. But now Christ came as a high priest of good things to come, with greater and more perfect tabernacle, but not one made with hands. That is to say, it is of his creation. So it's not with the blood of bulls and calves, but with his own blood he entered the holy place, once and for all, having ordained eternal redemption. So the writer of the Hebrews, he's making a direct reference here to what's going on in Leviticus and saying Jesus is now himself the high priest, and he only needed to go in once because he paid for the whole thing. He did it all in one go. Picking up from the same chapter in verse 24, it colours it in more for us. For Christ has not entered the holy place made with hands, which are copies of the true, but into heaven itself. So in other words, the tabernacle representing the dwelling place of God, which of course is now heaven itself, Christ is able to enter there, the text continues, to appear in the presence of God for us. Not that he should offer himself as the high priest enters the Holy of Holies every year with the blood of another. He then would suffer himself even since the foundation of the world. But now, once at the end of the ages, he has appeared and put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. There it is again. He's saying that he only needed to do it once. Verse 27 continues, it is appointed unto men that they should once to die, but after that the judgment. So Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many, everyone, to anyone, to any of those who eagerly wait and accept him. And then it says he will appear the second time apart from sin for salvation. So repeatedly, the writer to the Hebrews is saying, when Christ did it, he did it once. In stark contrast, even to the Day of Atonement, that supposed great day of settling the debt of sin, which still needed to be done every year. Now drop back into Leviticus chapter 10, verse 12 says, "But this man, by this man, he has offered one sacrifice for sins forever, and now sits down at the right hand of God." We don't have to wonder what the New Testament writers think about the Day of Atonement, because here they're telling us that, yeah, that was done every year, but look, Christ has done it. Atonement has occurred, and it's occurred once and for all. Returning back to chapter 9, verse 14, it says this: "The blood of bulls and goats, and the ashes of a heifer, the sprinkling of blood, the sprinkling for the unclean, the sanctifying for the purification of the flesh. Yet how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offers himself without spot to God, how much will that clean your conscience from dead works, in order that you can serve the living God?" Once and for all, to clean us in order that we are fit to be in the presence of God and fit to serve. Now, the other application, that, my friends, is the message of the Day of Atonement. Christ has done it, and Christ has atoned for us, and he did it once and for all, completely, to pay for all sin. When he died on the cross, he put down everything as a sacrifice that was needed to pay our debts eternally, so that we can live our lives eternally in the presence and with the presence of God in our lives. And he did it once, and by doing that, he has enabled us to do what? To serve. So what should that service look like? Again, the book of Hebrews will tell us forward. Is it going to be like these guys with these endless rituals trying to atone for sin? Let's hear what the service looks like, what the sacrifice, this once and for all sacrifice of Jesus has done for us. He says in chapter 10, verse 22, "Let us now draw near with a true heart, in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, and not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting, encouraging one another, and so much more as you see the day approaching." So basically, Hebrews tells us that all of this, the reason that this was done, is so that we could be in the presence of God, so that we can serve God. And for us, that service is given in the fact of it saying is, we serve by considering one another, loving one another like God loves, and doing good works to help and encourage and exhort one, not just one another, but the wider communities in which we live. The people that the book of Hebrews written were Christian Jews who were thinking, considering, because of persecution, whether they should go back to Judaism. And the writer to Hebrews is saying, don't forsake Christianity. Why would you want to go back to this old way of living? Instead, encourage one another to see the fact that Christ has done this once and for all, and he's coming back. And that all we need to do now is simply live a life of service in terms of loving one another and supporting one another until he returns. In other words, he's saying, why would you go back? You don't have to worry about the sin debt anymore. You don't have to do anything to take care of that. That's all been taken care of now. So now, instead of serving in this ritualized way, you can serve simply by loving the Lord and serving one another. So what it's saying, yes, the Day of Atonement, yes, it took place in Moses' day, but it had to happen every year. But now it's taken place again for us as Christian believers, but it took place on one day, and one day in history only, and it took place on that day on a cross called Calvary. Okay, people, that's it for today. Thanks for being with me. Can I remind you that new episodes for this podcast are posted pretty much every week, Monday to Friday, with occasional bonus episodes dropped in here and there. If you found this helpful, then why not subscribe to it, and that way you never miss another single episode. How about putting a like or sharing it on social media if you feel you'd like to encourage others to make the same decision to join in our community of people around the world who've made the decision to study the Bible in depth over how many years it takes. And also, if you're finding it helpful, then why not visit us on thebibleproject.buzzsprout.com. That's the host page, and that's the place where you find active links to places. Well, within Buzzsprout itself, there is a full episode notes page giving an overview in about 500 or 600 words of what this was all about today and every day. But also, I put up a full transcript of each and everything I said. The full text of what I've said, not in the rolling YouTube type thing, which isn't really useful. This is something that you can literally download, copy and paste, use in whatever way you want to help you in your personal time with the Lord or in preparation of study materials for others. Everything I do is put in the public domain with my blessing, and I trust the Lord's for you to use in whatever way you want, to be used to encourage the saints to works of service. And I'm able to do that because of the few people who've made the decision to support this ministry. And you can do that there also. You'll find a link to a place called Patreon and others. Patreon's definitely the best because that's the place where I'm able to create a community and to enter into communication with those people there. So there's a messaging system, and that's also the place where I post bonus episodes. Things that are just works in preparation, or talks and stuff I'm doing in secular environments, or occasionally when preaching at a church if it's recorded, those sort of things, just as a thank you and a bonus episode to give you an insight into the background of what's going on in my own personal Christian life and discipleship journey. And that's the place. Patreon is where you can become part of that little community. Without that group of people, none of this would be free and freely available on all these places that it is available. I couldn't possibly even begin to do that without them. This is a seed faith ministry. It grows at the level God calls people to support it that way. By all means, the vast majority of you, just with my blessing, take it, use it, and be encouraged by it in whatever way is helpful for you. So with that all said, I'll say bye-bye for now, and I hope to see you back here again tomorrow, or whatever day it is for you. Remember, you can go right back to the very beginning and just do this at whatever pace suits you and take as long as you want. The desire is to make this teaching and keep it available pretty much forever, so it's there on the internet as a complete resource always. So thanks again. Thank you to everyone for joining me, and I'll say bye-bye for now.